have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Reza Pahlavi is packing his toothbrush again. As protests grow in Iran, the exiled crown prince has been popping up for media appearances from his home in the Maryland suburbs near Washington, D.C. As we enter yet another cycle of Persian proto-revolution, we're saying he shouldn't count those air miles just yet.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump says that Greenland's defenses are 2 dogs and a sled. Handy, because America has 3 dogs and 2 sleds. The Danes have been humiliated already, but can anything useful still come from the biggest gorilla in the room turning on his kin? We'll be watching as Nato slides into the mid-Atlantic.
Finally, when Jerome Powell is putting out hostage-style video statements, you may have squeezed the Fed too hard. Or have you? Whatever the details of the present spat, is there still a place for independent central banking in the Western model?
But first...
Not without my Shah.
Every few years, we get an update on Iran that the regime is about to fall. I think in my adult life, I've lived through, 3 or 4 of these, I think. I should probably go and research how many of these I've lived through. But I definitely recall every 5 years or 6 years, we get the Iran regime is going to fall, and we get protests, and we get feminists in Paris, and, the usual smorgasbord of ops or whatever, optics, whatever we call it. But yeah, last week, obviously, things heated up in Iran. Protests started, ostensibly in response to inflation and inflation crisis. But when I looked into that, I didn't see much evidence for it. Iran has terrible inflation. The rial, the currency, is in a terrible way. But it's been like that for 2 years or something. There was a slightly sharp move in the foreign exchange rate before all this happened, but not enough to impact people. And the inflation from that, which probably wouldn't have been much because it wasn't a huge move, wouldn't have fed through into the system yet. So I don't really know. I don't know what's going on in Iran. I think anyone who tells you that they know what the actual driving force for the protests is probably kind of not telling the truth, to be honest. But, they seem to have something to do with the standard of living. We're recording on Tuesday, and I would not say that the smoke has cleared yet. I think probably the smoke will have cleared by later in the week. But I think it's kind of provisionally cleared, so people can take with a grain of salt what we're saying, but I think we kind of know what's going on. Now, if the podcast comes out later in the week and the Ayatollah is being dragged through the streets, we apologize for our extremely poor predictions. But right now, I will give you a sense of at least what looks like is going on. So the protests started last week, and they turned violent pretty quickly. Not the protests themselves. As far as we can tell, it's all very ropey. You're watching video, you don't know what's what. But as far as, I can tell anyway, the protests themselves were just normal protests, and then there was kind of violent side events. And the violence emerged very quickly. Usually when protests happen, the violence emerges down the line or whatever. And the violence seemed quite intense. There were some very disruptive videos on the internet. Anyway, everyone was anticipating that the protests would accelerate, and potentially the violence would accelerate too over the weekend, obviously because protesters like weekends and weekends like protesters, and that, then the regime would fall or something like that. And something slightly unexpected happened. Now, if the protests had gone ahead over the weekend, or they'd continued, or they'd escalated, or anything like that, it does not mean that the regime was going to fall. We've had protests in Iran before. The regime is pretty robust as far as I can tell. But even beyond the fact that, protests don't automatically mean that the regime falls, something slightly unexpected happened over the weekend. And that was that the entire internet went dark in Iran. They shut down the whole internet. And so you had this strange set of circumstances for us living in the open world era of X and online whatever, that we had all these kind of video leaks and videos of protests and Snapchats and TikToks and all the usual stuff up until, I don't know, Friday or Saturday. And then we had complete radio silence. No new videos were coming out. Pretty much no new anything. I saw a few like voice notes or something, but really it went dark. And basically the internet went dark in Iran. Now, nobody doubts the capability of a government to shut down the national internet. Like, you just literally shut down, the internet. It's a national thing. You just shut down the networks or whatever. But what was supposed to happen in that instance where a government shuts down the internet because they're afraid of social unrest is that the magic wand of Starlink was supposed to appear in the night sky and allow people to continue using the internet. And that appears not to have happened. It appears, and there are reports in this in the Western press and in the Iranian press, that basically the government deployed pretty extensive electronic warfare equipment, which it appears they bought from Russia, which apparently is very far advanced in this equipment. And they deployed this all over Iran, and it seems like they knocked out Starlink. I mean, as far as I can tell, they pretty much knocked it out. Now, there are kind of conflicting reports. Some people are saying like it's 30% packet losses. They say some people are saying 80. As far as I can tell, they've concentrated the electronic warfare in the trouble spots. And so you can probably get moderate internet if you're not in a trouble spot. But in the trouble spots, it appears that they've effectively slowed the internet down to the point that it's basically kind of dial-up from our childhood days, which means you can upload video. Even uploading audio is extremely difficult for those of us of a certain vintage who used to download MP3s during the dial-up days. You know what it's like. And this appears to have happened. And now, just before actually I came on, I see reports all over X that they're like arresting a bunch of people and seizing a bunch of Starlink equipment. And actually, I can't confirm this. I'm not like a tech genius or anything, but the Guardian article said that they actually could potentially use the Starlink data, the Starlink signals, to actually detect people. If you deploy the electronic warfare grid, you scramble everything, and then if you see clear signals going up, I don't fully understand how it works, but apparently, again, this is according to a Western publication that has ties to British national security, let's be honest. If you see these signals going up, you can actually use them to track down the terminals themselves, the Starlink terminals. And again, as far as I understand it, currently in Iran, it is illegal to possess a Starlink terminal. So the one final thing I'll say is the Guardian article also said, and I think this is quite likely, actually, I think the Guardian article was published before the West got a kind of a coherent narrative on what's just happened. So it might be the last honest report we hear about this in the West. But they also said that after this, they expect Iran to create a national internet. Similar to China, so create some sort of a firewall system. And so that kind of gives us an overall perspective on what a strategy might look like in a regime change scenario. Basically, if you have the right gear now, and a regime change scenario starts to kick off in your country, you can nuke the internet for a couple of days, and then you can not only interfere with Starlink, which was supposed to prevent that, but you can also use the system you've created with the electronic warfare systems, combined with presumably other apparatuses of some sort, to track down the individuals trying to break through the interference. And then, when it's all over, you use the whole thing as an excuse to create a national internet, similar to China's. So I think this is actually an extremely large development. I think other countries all over the world are going to be paying very close attention to what's happening in Iran right now. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens moving forward.
It does indeed seem at the moment, Philip, that the momentum, at least we can say, of these protests has kind of petered out a little bit. So maybe there are still protests. Maybe the protests in Tehran and in other cities in Iran are at similar levels to that which they were at the back end of last week. But the momentum that they seem to be gaining over the weekend, where they were increasing in size and violence, I think has paused at the very least. I think that's what we can say, that momentum hasn't continued at the time of recording. But as you rightly said, things can change. What I'll say about the situation in Iran at the moment is this, and it's namely that, I mean, we can get on to what outside powers like the US and Israel or Russia and China want. We can get onto that later, but I think it's fairly obvious at this stage what they want in general terms, if not specifics. What I would say, though, about this is that we ought to be relatively dispassionate when we view these protests. I've noticed a trend on X, formerly Twitter, that geopolitics can often be treated as a spectator sport, where you're in favor of Team West or Team USA, and therefore you cheer on the protesters, or you don't like the way the US behaves, or you don't like the EU, or you don't like the West in general, and therefore you cheer on the regime in Iran. And I think what we have to do, Philip, is be quite dispassionate about this, be disinterested in the outcome. And one thing it's important to say is that when you have a country that has a very specific political system, I mean, anybody can go on Wikipedia and try to understand the Iranian constitutional system, and it's not as simple as you might imagine. It has a very specific view on religion, which not everybody in Iran shares. And not only that, but it is authoritarian, I think we can say. I don't think it's totalitarian, but I think it's an authoritarian place. In addition to that, by all accounts, as far as I understand, it's pretty corrupt and it's pretty poor. I'm not saying it's like, fully third world, or I'm not saying it's utterly venal in its corruption, but I think by Western standards it would be considered both poor and corrupt. Now, in such a nation where you don't have the release valve that a truly open and pluralistic democratic process could afford, then resentment tends to build up because that kind of pressure doesn't get released. People get frustrated at the petty corruption. Maybe they're shaken down by a police officer on the street, and it leaves them with insufficient money for the week, or maybe they have to pay off some bureaucrat to get a license to do whatever. This kind of process is tremendously frustrating. It creates cynicism. It creates disdain. And then if you get an economic downturn in any way, then bang, spark. You start to get protests, and they can quickly gain force as people release that anger. And then if you throw into that also outside powers who have fairly impressive intelligence operations and who want to stoke the flames of such conflict, then you really can have a combustible situation on your hand. And I don't think that we should forget that when we're looking at this situation. Having said that, it's very obvious that both the United States, I mean, the US is saying so outright, but also Israel, are very keen in removing the current government or the current governing elite of Iran and replacing them with something else. I suspect the US would like a pliable puppet, like, a return of the Shah, as singularly unimpressive as he is. I suspect more strongly, however, that the Israelis would like to basically have a serious situation where the current regime, the Iranian Revolution, is finally defeated and removed. And what replaces it isn't a stable national government of Iran, but instead a competing and chaotic set of armed and competing interests, whether they be geographical. For instance, the Azerbaijani population might want to join Azerbaijan itself and secede. The Kurds might want to have their own autonomous or even independent sovereign nation from Iran. Outside powers then get involved: Turkey, Azerbaijan, the US, Israel. The Saudis would have to get involved in that sort of situation. Well, the Pakistanis and the Afghanis would probably get involved in that situation. But then you might also have competing political outlooks. You might have communists, you might have hardcore Persian nationalists. You would probably still have some kind of Muslim theocrats who would like to get involved. And in that way, you get an incredibly chaotic situation. There would be no defense in that sense from outside powers getting involved. So countries like the US and Israel and Turkey and Azerbaijan and Pakistan and probably China could cause problem at their own will. And of course, the US and Israel would be and Turkey and Azerbaijan would be best placed to do this. And it would just absolutely devastate the country. It would weaken it beyond all recognition. It would render it absolutely incapable of posing any threat to Israel for at least a decade, depending on how long that process lasted, plus maybe a decade after. And when it was over, it would be so weak, like Syria is now, that Israel could just literally dictate terms to it, as it is in Syria now. Turkey could literally just march in and take over the government, as it did in Syria. Like, I think this is the preferred scenario for Iran from the Israelis. I suspect the US would like something different, and I'm damn sure the Europeans want something different, because if there was that type of chaotic regime change, chaotic and violent regime change, and descent into civil war, then you have 90 million Iranians and a significant Iranian diaspora already in Europe. It would just cause a huge amount of migration pressure. It might even crack European governments if that happened. It would certainly sweep in the populists that the current elites are fighting tooth and claw to defend. So, I think from a European perspective, be careful what you wish for. I think from an Israeli perspective, it's quite clear what they want. I think the US are a little bit more ambiguous, except in general, they want the current regime out. Whether this can work or not, I don't know. It looks at the moment, as I said, as though the regime has managed to press pause and the momentum has been stopped at least, if not the entire protest movement defeated as yet.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to make any firm predictions, especially considering it hasn't reached its logical conclusion or fully petered out yet. But it does kind of come back to, the show we had last week, and we were talking about the Venezuela situation, and I talked about, capacities to actually do this kind of stuff. Like, protests don't just automatically result in the regime falling apart, right? I mean, there's massive protests in the United States right now about the ICE killing, right? And nobody thinks oh, well, that's going to lead to the regime falling apart. There's often massive protests in France. Nobody ever thinks that's going to lead to the regime falling apart. There are specific steps between protests and the regime falling apart that have to take effect, right? They have to get people within the regime to defect to the protest side and all this. We discussed it on the Venezuela issue last week, and it feels to me increasingly like the Trump administration are trying to get geopolitical events to play to their timeline, right? We're at the start of 2026, and we've already had, the 13th today of January, and we've already had two sort of regime change operations in the first 2 weeks, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's we want to open the new year with some big, geopolitical shift that involves Venezuela and Iran, and maybe somebody else. Greenland, we'll talk about later, is a different issue. And the world just doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that at all. As I said on the podcast last week, if the Americans had the capacity to overthrow the Venezuelan government under any previous president, going right back to Bush, they would have taken it. They would have immediately taken that opportunity and pushed Maduro or Chavez before him off his perch because they wanted them out of there. They always wanted them out of there. The same holds doubly true for Iran. Venezuela just seized nationalized oil assets. Iran, the relationship between Iran and America has been terrible, going right back to the Iranian Revolution and the kidnapping of the embassy staff shortly afterwards. So if they had the capacity, they would have pushed the regime change button on Iran years ago. So it feels to me like they're kind of coming along and trying to force fit events into the calendar that the Americans have in mind. But as I said, the world doesn't work like that. And the other indication that this is kind of a little bit janky is the Americans pushing forward as the potential successor to the current Iranian regime, the Shah. Look, I don't know that much about internal Iranian politics. I know there are kind of a liberal faction that want less theocratic rule, or they don't want the mullahs in charge, or they don't want, certain rules in place that restrict their personal freedoms or whatever. But I don't get the sense that there's a big element of royalists in Iran. I don't think the Shah's father, the pretender to the throne now's father, was a particularly popular figure in Iran. I don't think that. I mean, he was overthrown in a revolution. So, and he was seen kind of as a foreign puppet of the British and the Americans and so on. As I said, I don't know the internal politics that well in Iran, but I've never really seen much evidence that there's this large contingent of royalists who desperately want the Shah to return. And yet that's what we've seen. We've seen people waving around Iranian flags with the lion in the middle, which is apparently the flag of the old royalist regime before the Iranian Revolution. And so all of this just says to me, like, I think this is all like an attempt to push the accelerate button on something that doesn't have an accelerate button. And, that's just not how foreign affairs works. That's not how, successful regime change operations or whatever works. And I increasingly think that, like, they're going to push a bunch of these buttons prematurely, if they're ever even viable. I don't know, but I don't think they're viable, like, immediately in January 2026. And they're going to push all these buttons, and none of them are going to work. And then what happens afterwards? People are just going to be completely confused. For probably about 6 months afterwards, people are going to go, do we control Venezuela? I don't know. I think so. Did the Iranian regime fall? Don't know. Maybe. It's a really weird moment to be living in, really. And I think it's really quite discrediting, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's fairly clear that some of the cheerleaders for this are both clueless and idiotic. A friend of yours, Philip Pilkington, Aaron Bastani, was lambasting people on Twitter for their views on the Shah and the royalist cause in Iran just the other day. I recommend listeners go and look that up. But in more general terms, one thing I would say about this is yet another revolution that we're seeing that is much more violent than the old colour revolutions from Eastern Europe and more broadly the world. And one of the themes that we struck on last year, Philip, was that it seemed that governments had got to grips with colour revolutions. But in response, those who would wish to foment them were becoming much more violent. We looked at what happened in Nepal. We looked at what happened in Madagascar. We looked at what happened in Mexico. Now we're seeing what's happening in Iran. And these are far more violent and, I would say, have a far greater tinge of nihilism about them. Those old colour revolutions, at least you could say there was some kind of hope about them, that, people would move the country forward into some, bright, sunny, liberal, progressive, Western, European future, right? Like that's what it was all about. These seem far more violent, far more just about expressing anger and expressing feelings, and they don't have that old hope. And I think people getting excited about this is really indicative of, and there are people getting really excited about, like almost giddy with excitement, like wailing at the BBC for not kind of covering the protests more, getting really upset for not kind of criticizing the Iranian regime, like really getting into it like it's a football match and their team is playing. And otherwise relatively serious people as well, I would say, people like Andrew Neil, who is, I would say, Britain's finest political interviewer and an otherwise superb journalist, but just seems to lose the plot when it comes to foreign policy. So, I think that's an important trend to look at. It's like the increase in violence of revolutions. We're moving back to an age of the old-fashioned putsch attempt and the old-fashioned popular riot that bursts into the post office and attempts to get into the parliament and the army barracks and overturn the regime in a violent way. I think that's definitely a trend that we're seeing playing out in Iran as well. Whether it'll work is an entirely different matter. Watch this space. It doesn't look at present as if it is.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, maybe it's a bunch of nostalgia, actually. Maybe what's happening here is that the West is kind of diminishing in power and importance, and as many people do when, personally they diminish in power and importance, they revert to nostalgia. They start thinking about the good old days. I wonder if that's what we're seeing here. Green-eyed monster.
This seems a little bit of a hokey idea that It's well known that Donald Trump would like foreign policy to revert to a pre-Wilsonian era of 19th century great power politics with spheres of control and decisions made based on might is right and the cool, rational understanding and assessment of relative power. And all of that entails. He's not a big fan of multilateralism. He's not a big fan of internationalism. He's clearly not a fan of international law, although I think personally that how unique he is in that as American president is rather overrated when you look at some of the things that Messrs. Clinton, Bush II, Obama and Biden got up to. I don't think any of them were particularly paragons of the so-called rules-based international order. Nevertheless, it's well known that Donald Trump would rather do business in international terms on a more 19th century than 20th century basis. Part of what went on back in the day, of course, were land exchanges and land transfers and land purchases. The US purchased much land, the Louisiana territories, which covers a great many states from Mississippi up to the Dakotas, Florida, Alaska, all included. The US, of course, annexed about a third of Mexican territory, states like California and Oregon and Utah, I believe, as well, and New Mexico. All of those states used to be Mexico itself. The US annexed them. And the big one now is that Trump would like Greenland. I think by now the geopolitical reasons for that are well known. The Arctic ice is not going as far as it used to, and in summer months at least, the Northwest Passage, which is a shipping line that goes between Alaska and Russia, and then up around the north coast of Canada, threads its way through all of those Canadian islands, and then down the eastern seaboard of the United States, that's now open. The Russians have got their own northern sea route, which of course goes around the Arctic Sea and the north of Siberia, and then eventually to the Kola Peninsula, and then down into the North Sea, into places like Rotterdam and Felixstowe and London. But these sea channels are now going to be open, and controlling Greenland would mean that the US controlled both the entrance and exit to the Northwestern Passage via Greenland and Alaska. It would also mean that it had a much greater claim on the Arctic itself. And again, the Russians are a little bit ahead on this. They've been staking their claim to Arctic territory. There are supposedly incredible natural resources. It's a bit of a white El Dorado, the Arctic, I suppose, when it comes to natural resources and rumors of all the oil and the gas and the minerals that are under the Arctic Ocean on the seabed. So that, in theory, potentially in the future, as the Arctic ice cap melts further because everyone believes in global warming, that's also going to be worth something. And of course, having Greenland would give the US a much bigger claim, because maritime claims move outward from the edges of your territory. Okay. The final reason, which I think is a smaller one, is it would give the US actual physical control over one edge of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So this is the line from Scotland in the United Kingdom through Iceland to the east coast of Greenland. And the gap between Scotland and Iceland, and then between Iceland and Greenland, is the entry point for Soviet nuclear submarines into the North Atlantic. It's the entry point by which Soviet submarines would, and indeed Soviet air assets, Soviet maritime bombing assets, would be able to enter the North Atlantic and thus interdict Allied shipping going from the US to Europe. Now, if you think that the United States under D. Trump is going to have to be running or going to want to run reforger Atlantic convoys, return forces to Germany, reforger Atlantic convoys to support Europe, to stave off the Russian Federation, well, I've got a huge block of ice to sell you, because He's not going to want to do that. No such war is going to require it. And indeed, these days, we have neither the materiel nor the manpower to actually justify these huge Cold War era reforger convoys. Although I believe I'm right in saying that 1 or 2 test runs have been done in the last decade or so. The other point about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap from a geostrategic point of view is that since the fall of the Soviet Union, Western alliance, i.e. NATO, naval power and aerial power, has become so much greater than the Russian equivalent that these days that gap isn't even Greenland, Iceland, and UK. It's actually the north of Greenland, Svalbard, the Norwegian island, and Norway. I mean, they have the Russians bottled up right into the Barents Sea and right into the Kola Peninsula. So the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap is much less important than it used to be. I would like to posit this, though, Philip Pilkington, and maybe you can disagree. I know this is a show about geopolitics and geoeconomics and the rise of the multipolar world order, but I would like to posit something else. I would like to suggest that the Greenland thing is all about personal motives and personality. I have a feeling that Greenland is as much about Donald J. Trump wanting to be the first president to expand American territory since what? The early 19th century, even before that perhaps, or well, at least since the annexation of Mexican territory in the middle part of the 19th century. But in terms of purchases, I think even before that, when was Alaska purchased off the Russians? Anyway, I think he would like the feel-good factor of the US expanding again under him. I think he would love that personally, and I think quite rightly, in fact, it would be a big vote winner for him. And before you dismiss it, I'm not sure you should so quickly. Meantime, I think a lot of his supporters kind of love the idea too, because it's kind of like a virgin territory. Like, you can make this idea into whatever you want. Like, if you want it to be the construction of freedom cities on virgin land because you're a libertarian Silicon Valley bro, which is something I've read recently, you can make Greenland into that perfect opportunity. If you want to make it into America gaining self-reliance on rare earth minerals, you can make it into that opportunity. If you want to make it into America cementing its position both in the Arctic and in North America, you can make it into that as well. And Donald Trump, of course, can make it into he being the great man, one of those great presidents who expanded the United States of America, who gave it that 51st star on the flag. I think it's as much about that, Philip Pilkington, as it is about the geopolitical considerations I mentioned at the beginning of this.
Yeah, I think they'd probably be a lot better off just focusing on the geopolitical considerations. I mean, Greenland is pretty empty, but it's not fully empty. I think there's about 55,000 people living on Greenland, and they're Danish, as far as I understand it. They're basically Danes, and they settled it, I don't know when. And, I thought the strategy for going after Greenland, in effect, was going to be a hearts and minds campaign to convince the Danes, I guess, that live on Greenland, or the Greenlanders, or whatever they consider themselves, that they'd be better off under, an American security architecture or whatever. And I think that would have been viable. You start a campaign there, maybe an independence campaign. There's already independence campaigns in Greenland, as I understand it. And you latch onto them and you say that the economy is going to be better and all that. And instead of that, they're taking a kind of a hostile stance on it. And I think it's probably for the reasons that you just outlined, that there's a kind of a slight fantasy playing into this. Because the reality is, the Americans aren't going to settle Greenland. No one in America is going to go and live in Greenland for no reason. There's plenty of space in America if you want to go to a remote location or whatever. They'll probably, if they want to move some things over to Greenland, have to do extensive kind of tax breaks or something like that. And by the way, to do that, you need the cooperation of the Greenland government, or the, whatever comes after Danish rule, if that's what's going to happen. So from multiple perspectives, the best way to do it is some sort of a hearts and minds campaign and convince them that they'd be better off. Now, look, the Greenland thing has completely shaken up the Europeans. My understanding is they're even considering sending troops there. they're saying that they're sending the troops there to kind of mollify the Americans and like counter the narrative that the Chinese and the Russians threaten Greenland because they can like put European NATO troops there. And I'm kind of, geopolitically, I'm fine with that because it makes sure that the Europeans don't go and like create like some sort of a horrible war in Europe, sending their troops in to get absolutely eviscerated in the Donbass region. So I'm kind of two minds about it. But on the other hand, do we really want like a major military flashpoint between the United States and Europe? Because they say that they're sending these troops there to kind of mollify the Americans on them thinking that the Chinese and the Russians are going to take over Greenland or whatever. But everyone knows that's kind of rubbish. And actually, prior to that narrative coming out of the Europeans, there was calls to send troops to Greenland to prevent the United States from, physically taking it with troops. So I think that's actually the underlying intention. Now, if it turns out that they send troops over, the Europeans put some troops there, and they kind of wink and nudge, and they say to the Americans, "Oh, now you can't complain about Russian and Chinese influence," and that's taken all the attention away from Ukraine, which would be nice. As a European, I think would be nice. And then the Americans go, "Oh, haha, we're not actually going to send troops to Greenland. We just want to kind of like buy it, or we want to like run a referendum on independence or whatever." That's great. But I honestly think that I think that the plan hasn't really been made for Greenland yet. And the Trump administration is kind of throwing out possibilities and seeing what sticks. But I don't think a hostile kind of takeover is a good way to do this. I think a Hearts and Minds campaign is a much better idea for this. And that's how I thought they were going to play it. And now it increasingly seems like they're not. I mean, I saw some interviews bouncing around on X with Greenlanders in the capital city. Look, I'm sure there's some bias to it, and the Europeans probably sent in camera crews and found the people with the most negative opinions or whatever. But they weren't exactly people like screaming into the camera like, "Yankee, don't set foot on our soil." They were kind of reasonable people who were like, "Yeah, we live in a really peaceful place and we don't have a clue what's going on, and the whole thing's kind of weird and scary and blah, blah, blah." And then there was a young person who was like, "Oh yeah, what was it he said? That the Americans want to come in and steal the natural resources to pay off the US debt." And none of that's true, of course, but like, you don't really want to form the mindset in the country that you're going to be doing extensive business with, potentially even kind of bringing it into your orbit like a Puerto Rico or something. Like, you don't want to seed that mindset at the beginning, because it's just going to cause trouble for you. Are the Greenlanders going to rise up and throw you out of the landmass? No, they have no capability of doing that. But they can make life difficult. If you need the Greenland legislature to work with you, like, it's going to be harder to make them work with you, right? Just even think about it, like if you put military bases there and the soldiers have to go and into the capital city on their breaks, on their breaks from duty or whatever, and they just get like insulted by the locals. Like, it's not nice to have that. Like, there's no reason to have that. So again, I go back to what we said in the Iran segment and back to what I said last week. It feels like the Trump administration wants to get an awful lot done geopolitically, and they want to get it done to their timeline. And that's just not the way the world works. If you want to take over Greenland in some shape or form, there is a process and a way to do that. And it's a Hearts and Minds campaign, and it's convincing Greenlanders, at least some Greenlanders, that they're going to be better off living as a kind of an American, I don't know, not colony, but as an American kind of protectorate or something like that. And then you go and you figure out a way to make that happen, or you figure out a governance structure. That's fine. But that's going to take a while. And it feels to me like the Trump administration has kind of said to itself, 2026 is going to be the year where we get all our objectives complete. And that's that. And in cases like Venezuela and Iran, I doubt they can actually achieve these objectives, and they're just going to cause an awful lot of trouble for themselves. In the case of Greenland, I think they probably can achieve it, even if they take the wrong path. I think they can probably achieve it, and they can probably get it over the line quicker than otherwise building a Hearts and Minds campaign would have been. But if they do that, they're going to regret it for a generation. They're going to regret it for 25 years, rather than putting the work in for a couple of years, building a Hearts and Minds campaign and bringing a friendly Greenland into the orbit of the United States. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll see what their actual strategy is. I think any strategy will probably end up working with Greenland, but it'll have negative outcomes if you do it wrong. The one thing that would concern me is that the Europeans put troops there and the Americans actually did like challenge the Europeans to like take a pop at them or something by landing troops there. I don't think it'll get to that, but if it ever does get to that, like that will have major ramifications. And being a fairly strong proponent that Europe and America should kind of go their own way on security issues, I don't want to see them go their own way in that way. Like that could be actually quite destructive to economic relations, to, the limited security relations that we'll need post NATO, because we will need them. Like people will need to talk to each other, all that kind of thing. So, I'm always I'm a small C conservative with this stuff. And if you want to make big changes, you should make those big changes in the most kind of responsible and measured way that you possibly can. America has clearly made a decision on Greenland. It will end up winning that one in some shape or form. But why make a mess out of it? I don't get it.
Fed up.
Things are heating up around the Fed. It looks like Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, is not long left for this world. Trump wants to squeeze him out. Trump's wanted to squeeze him out for a while, but now they're really putting the screws on Jerome Powell and on the Fed. I believe they're launching some sort of an investigation into the Fed. A couple of things about this. The first thing is, I don't really understand why Jerome Powell decided to die on this hill. When Trump got in and made very clear that he did not want Jerome Powell, I don't know why Jerome Powell didn't just, as the kids say, take the L and resign. And maybe not resign immediately and try and figure out how to do it with some grace or whatever, but why not do that? I don't get it. Because if he wants to go down fighting with the ship, he's just going to make a whole mess out of independent central banks, out of the Fed's governance structure, everything. He's going to create a giant mess. And I don't know why he wants to do that. The problem, does the Trump administration want to end Federal Reserve independence? Probably it does. But if you're Jerome Powell and you dig your heels in, you're only accelerating that process. So I don't understand that. I can only attribute it to some sort of Trump derangement syndrome stuff, boomer mindset with Jerome Powell and the people he's talking to. Probably a bunch of kind of liberal economists around Powell whispering to him like, this is the fight that you have to take. But it's completely stupid politics from the perspective of the Federal Reserve, if you care about Federal Reserve independence and all this kind of thing. The other thing to say is, Jerome Powell's been an absolutely disastrous Fed chair, right? So when the inflation started in 2021, it started because the recent bout of inflation started because of the lockdowns. The lockdowns restrained supply capacity in the economy, and demand was actually pumped up by Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, and so we started to see inflation. And then it was worsened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when oil prices and so on went nuts. The Jerome Powell Federal Reserve Board did not take action on the inflation all throughout 2021. Inflation was rising. It was way above target as far as I can remember. I think it was like 6% or something like that. And the Federal Reserve Board, led by Jerome Powell, said, we're not raising interest rates. And it took months for them to respond. Now, just to be clear, I don't think interest rates are a catch-all solution to inflation. I think inflation is much more complex than that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not very impressed with the central bank model as a means of economic management anyway. But on their own terms, they say that they're targeting inflation, and they say that their tool to target inflation are interest rates. And they didn't, Jerome Powell and his buddies didn't raise interest rates. To my mind, that is the clearest manifestation that you've failed on your job, as you can possibly get. Like, economics is very hard, like big macroeconomic decisions and big macroeconomic policy is often very hard to falsify because there's so many contingent outcomes and there's so many ceteris paribus, all things being equal clauses, all this kind of thing. But if you want one really, really clear indication that somebody's failed, it's that they set an inflation target of 2%. They say that we control the inflation by raising interest rates or lowering it. And you don't raise interest rates when the inflation takes off because you say, as they said at the time, inflation is quote unquote transient. And then after a couple of months, you admit it's not transient and that you've raised rates too late. Okay, there's no clearer indication that somebody has failed at their job in macroeconomic policy than that. And yet Jerome Powell just kept going. Why did he keep going? I'll tell you why. Because no one in the economics profession, I'm not saying no one, but very few people, I was one of them, I have to say, but very few people said that this inflation could be a problem. They were in denial. Why were they in denial? I'll be very open about it. Because they all supported lockdowns. They were all really into lockdowns. Your average economist was like really into the lockdowns. They were emotionally invested in them. And so they didn't want to admit to themselves that it could have negative economic consequences. And so they circled the wagons. That's exactly what they did. No one called on Jerome Powell, no one serious, quote unquote, called for Jerome Powell to step down because they all made the wrong call. An entire profession said that inflation's going to be transient because, this is my reading, we were emotionally invested in the lockdowns and we don't want to admit that they could cause any economic damage. And therefore, since we all bought into this narrative, Jerome Powell's fine because he's one of the gang. It's the old Keynes quote that it's better to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. This is a classic manifestation of that. So I have no sympathy for Jerome Powell. I think that this expert class in the economic technocrat sphere have completely discredited themselves. Like their QE programs didn't work, they miscalled inflation, and any time they get something wrong, they circle the wagon. And now here comes big bad Donald Trump, and he's launching probes into your organization, and he's calling for the Fed chief to step down. And what do they do? What do the economists do? They clutch their pearls. They clutch their pearls and they say, oh no, this isn't fair. We're experts. We have a book of tricks that will allow us to maximize economic growth and everything like that. And the thing is, they think no one can challenge them because they think that nobody can speak their language, quote unquote, sufficiently to criticize them. And often that's true in their own circles. There's a few dissident kind of economists who can criticize them, but they don't pay any attention to them. They ignore them. Well, now it's past that. Now the politics have turned on you. So it doesn't matter. Donald Trump doesn't have to turn around and say they missed inflation by 4 months and that's why I'm getting rid of Jerome Powell. They just sense that crowd don't have a clue what they're doing and we don't trust them. And so we're going to go after them politically. And the economists go, how dare you go after us politically? We're scientists. But it's not working anymore. So look, is it good that Donald Trump takes over the Federal Reserve and presumably like forces them to lower interest rates earlier than they should have? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm pretty open-minded about that. I don't think there's a lot of inflation risk in the United States right now. If they want to lower interest rates, I don't think it's going to do much damage. It might cause some problems if we have dollar instability, but you know, maybe. That's all very speculative. So I don't think it can do a lot of damage. But primarily, beyond any question of short-term interest rate policy or short-term Federal Reserve policy, yeah, I kind of wouldn't mind seeing these guys kind of get their comeuppance. But they will go to their grave saying, oh, it was so unfair, it was all political, and we were just good scientists trying to maintain the stewardship of the economy. And they'll never admit that they got like literally maybe 15 years worth of policy completely wrong and provably wrong. And the very end of it, where they miscalled inflation, like it's not even a gray area. You don't even need an econometric test to prove it. It's just so prima facie obvious that they all missed inflation, but they don't want to hear it. And now look where we are. Gold is soaring. The dollar's in collapse, basically. I mean, look at the absolute mess that they've left behind. So I have no sympathy. I'd like to see them being cleared out with a rational person sitting behind a desk and explaining all their failures and saying, you know, it's very clear that you failed on inflation and et cetera, et cetera. But that was never going to work because they don't listen. So if they're not going to listen to that, they're going to get the big iron fist of Donald Trump on their head. So yeah, cry harder, guys.
I actually think that's a very good point. I think that is the salient point, and I think it applies in the Western system or the Western paradigm, if I can use that horrible management speak word. The Western paradigm of governance can be criticized in exactly the same way and for the same reasons. Like, we gave experts far greater independence. In Britain, that's known as quangos, right? Like quasi-governmental organizations that are kind of like arm's length committees and bodies of experts that oversee certain policies. The most famous quango, and the biggest quango, of course, although it's not often recognized as one, is the Bank of England. Now, the Bank of England was only given independence in 1998. Before that, interest rates were set by the government of the day. And, Britain got on fairly well. I mean, even those people who progress to be kind of monetary and fiscal hawks and take their economics very seriously would probably concede that they're the same people who would say that the economy did great under Margaret Thatcher, and under Margaret Thatcher, her chancellors, Geoffrey Howe and then Nigel Lawson and eventually John Major, set monetary policy. Now, it is true, Philip Pilkington, that governments had a bit of a reputation when it came to monetary policy, where 9 or 6 months before an election, they would kind of loosen interest rates right off and kind of like gun monetary creation a little bit in the hope that by the time the election swung round, the economy would be going gangbusters and inflation wouldn't have reared its ugly head yet, and they could deal with the fallout once they got elected for another 5 years. But as I say, there was no, the world didn't end just because monetary policy was under democratic control. And as a general point, and I hate to slip into my own personal politics here, but isn't monetary policy kind of an important economic lever? I think it's just as important in its own way as fiscal policy, is it not? And if you live in a democracy, don't you want that under democratic control? Well, so anyway, since we had this spate of central banks turning independent in the late 90s and early 2000s, the French central bank used to be under government or democratic control. The Swedish National Bank did. The Japanese National Bank did. The Bank of England did. And they were all made independent, just like the Federal Reserve had been since 1913. All these banks were made independent in the late 90s, early 2000s by various means. What's their record been since? What has their record been like since? I'm not even sure it's that good. Their great claim to fame is that these technocrats managed to tame inflation in the 1990s and early 2000s. Their claim to fame is that from the mid-1960s right through until the late 1980s, early 1990s, inflation had been a problem in Western economies. And their argument was that their technocratic playbook, if you like, had worked successfully in taming inflation in the 1990s and early 2000s to create a stably low inflation environment. And that was a positive thing. I kind of question that, Philip Pilkington, and you'll be able to say better than me, but my suspicion is that what really tamed inflation in the Western world was the introduction of all of the former communist bloc nations into the global free trade economy. Firstly, with the Soviet nations, which added some 200 million workers into the European worker pool, essentially. And then even more so with the Chinese economy, introducing a massive amount of low-wage industry and low-wage products into Western economies. I think that, as much as anything, was what really tamed inflation. I mean, even if you read John Major, he said that Britain dropping out of the European monetary mechanism through which the pound sterling was pegged to the old Deutschmark. He said that dropping out of that was what finally rang inflation out of the economy, not central bank, amazing central bank monetary management. But as I say, I think in general, what created this low inflation environment for the Western world was the introduction of China into the global economy, especially after 1998 when they both joined the WTO. And in addition to that, they shifted their own monetary management and trade management to accumulate large amounts of reserves So they would avoid having the IMF come when there was a sudden withdrawal of hot capital from their economies. So they shifted to accumulating massive amounts of reserves, which then had to be recycled into Western economies, and lowered interest rates by doing that, right? As simple as that. It forced interest rates down. And the central bankers claim this is a great success, but I'm not sure it had anything to do with them whatsoever. Then, of course, you had the credit crisis, which they seem not to see at all. Then you had QE, which, maybe averted the Great Depression, but I'm not sure it caused... I mean, you can maybe tell the story on that a little bit better, but I'm not sure it can be considered a massive success given what's given after. And the latest one, as you say, was the inflation is transitory mistake, which was an absolute whopper. I'm not sure these guys have got such a great success record. And given the fact you're taking one of the key levers of economic control away from democratic control or democratic oversight, I'm not sure that the argument is strong enough to do that, essentially, in countries where you supposedly believe in democracy.